And I gather I have to do a countdown. Unacceptable. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Can you hear now?
Yep, I can hear you, Ron.
Okay. Well, thank you all. And this is the first of 3 hearings this week in the Senate Finance Committee. And we're now going to, I'll have an opening statement, and then Senator Crapo will have an opening statement. And then as part of the introduction of our 5 witnesses, we'd like to turn to our colleague, Senator Brown, to introduce his friend and Ohioan, Mr. Blatt. The Finance Committee has worked hard over the last year to tackle the public health and jobs crises brought on by COVID-19. Today, the committee meets to discuss another challenge the pandemic exposed: the fragility of our supply chains and the need to boost manufacturing in America. Now, when COVID-19 exploded, factories around the globe shut down and supply chains were cut. Most Americans would recognize the effect of the supply chain crisis as something that I'd call a toilet paper problem.
Yes.
It seemed like the supply ran out in the blink of an eye, and overnight, nobody could get their hands on a package of toilet paper. Some sellers raised prices. Others restricted the marketplace to compensate for the shortages. The shelves still emptied, and Americans were facing a panic. Now, household paper products are one thing, but the reality is huge and vitally important parts of the economy are suffering from their own version of a toilet paper problem. For example, over the last year, there have been concerns about the supply of batteries and medicines and minerals that are used in electronics. There's still shortages of protective equipment that doctors and nurses need. Domestic producers, including one in Oregon, have been making high-quality respirators and other PPE, but it's still a market dominated by producers in China. The supply chain crisis set off the most alarm bells, particularly as it related to semiconductors. They're obviously an important component of cars and medical devices, appliances, phones and computers, defense technologies, you name it. Americans don't roll out of bed in the morning without flipping some switch or checking some device that relies on semiconductors. Disruptions at a single Taiwanese producer of semiconductors caused major headaches for manufacturers across the country, as well as our consumers. Factories here in the United States have gone quiet as a result of the shortage. The shock waves of this blow to the modern global economy continue to ripple out. It is a recipe for trouble when one single pandemic, natural disaster, or terrorist attack can sever brittle supply chains, hobble the economy, threaten our jobs, as well as put at risk our national security. So I'll close by saying we do have bipartisan interest now in addressing this issue, building up our domestic manufacturing to bolster the supply of semiconductors and other critical components and products. The president ordered a comprehensive review of supply chains in several different areas of our economy and national defense. The Biden administration has made it clear that nothing is off the table when it comes to strengthening our supply chains and our economy. In addition to America's national and economic security, fundamentally, and we will come back to this again and again, this is about high skill and high wage jobs for American workers. A lot of communities across the country have endured a steady decline since manufacturing peaked decades ago. Our manufacturing economy never fully recovered from the Great Recession before the pandemic hit. So we've got a big opportunity to turn this around. This is an area where my home state of Oregon is a national leader. Intel is one of our biggest employers. Our state is known for innovation that comes out of the Silicon Valley. Oregonians know that investments in R&D and advanced manufacturing brings those high skill, high wage jobs that are going to be the lodestar for this committee. Those are exactly the kind of jobs we want more of. The committee has a host of economic tools in the kit that can help shore up domestic manufacturing. For example, Senator Stabenow and Senator Daines are working with Senator Manchin on the advanced manufacturing credit. Senators Warner and Cornyn and others are working on the issue of chips. In my view, it is going to be critically important to look at the changes to the 2017 Trump tax law, which in fact created a disincentive for research and development. Fixing that issue and creating strong and reliable incentives is going to be key, because the United States must outcompete China and other countries, and you can't do it with short-term legislation and uncertainty. So I look forward to working with all the members on the committee on both sides of the aisle, because this is a premier economic challenge and, as stated, a job creation opportunity. I'm happy that we're joined by a panel of witnesses who can examine the issue from just about every angle. We're now going to turn to Senator Crapo, and then we'll have Senator Brown introduce Mr. Blatt. Our friend from our neighbor, Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Chairman Wyden. And thank you to all of our witnesses for being here with us today. And Mr. Chairman, thank you and your staff for collaborating with us on this bipartisan hearing. There are many areas within the Finance Committee's jurisdiction that are ripe for bipartisan support this Congress, and I look forward to working with you on those through regular order. Today's hearing will focus on the role of tax incentives for domestic manufacturing. The manufacturing sector is critical to the U.S. economy. In 2019, the manufacturing sector accounted for 11% of our GDP. The United States has experienced a net loss of manufacturing plants in every year from 1998 through 2018. The decline in domestic manufacturing jobs may be attributable to a number of factors, including increased automation and productivity, labor costs, and taxes. Taxes can play a significant role in a company's site selection process. Prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, the United States had one of the highest corporate income tax rates among developed countries. Also, before TCJA, the U.S. confronted pressures for domestic firms to invert or be acquired by foreign companies, leading to U.S. headquarters and jobs going abroad. Today, as a result of the TCJA, the United States now has a flat 21% corporate income tax rate. Pressures for inversions and acquisitions abated. Yet, despite the decreased rate, the U.S. still holds the 11th highest corporate tax rate among developed countries. The statutory corporate income tax rate is critical to the U.S. competitiveness in the global markets. Another key aspect to our competitiveness is capital investment. The Internal Revenue Code has a number of tax incentives for capital investment, which, when paired with a competitive corporate tax rate, are essential to promote domestic manufacturing. This is an area of bipartisan interest, and I welcome the opportunity to work with Chairman Wyden on this. For example, last year, Senators Cornyn and Warner introduced S3933, the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors for America Act, known as the CHIPS Act, which would create a 40% refundable investment tax credit for qualified semiconductor equipment or any qualified semiconductor manufacturing facility investment expenditures. This bill had 7 Republicans and 5 Democrats as co-sponsors. Another example, just this month, Senators Manchin, Stabenow, and Daines introduced S622, the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors for America Act, which offers an $8 billion increase to the Section 48C Advanced Manufacturing Tax Credit, available to manufacturers and other industrial users to retool, expand, or build new facilities that make or recycle energy-related products. Micron, Intel, and other American semiconductor manufacturers are operating in an increasingly competitive and sometimes unscrupulous market. Only a couple of years ago, Chinese state-owned companies stole trade secrets from Micron in an effort to gain an advantage against leading producers of a sought-after technology. Helping U.S. companies strengthen their supply chains to better protect these critical technologies is vital to safeguarding our national security and the health of our economy. Chairman Wyden, we have a great panel here representing a comprehensive range of perspectives from the business community, academia, as well as labor. I look forward to hearing their thoughts as we consider various tax proposals that can help to address the global semiconductor shortage, supply chain issues, and encourage domestic manufacturing activity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Well, this is obviously a premier issue for bringing both sides together, creating more American jobs through domestic manufacturing. We thank you for it. Senator Brown is juggling a tight schedule, and what we're going to do is have him give an introduction for his constituent, and then we'll start our witnesses with George Davis. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also Senator Crapo, thanks for getting to continue to work with you, not just on the Banking Housing Committee, but also in Finance. And I'm thrilled you're doing this hearing. It is really important. It's a privilege to introduce my longtime friend, Donnie Blatt. He's director of United Steelworker District 1. He's a member of the USW International Executive Board out of Pittsburgh. Donnie's from Hannibal, Ohio. He's been a member of USW Local 5720 for some 40 years. He worked in the Ormet aluminum plant for 22 years in Eastern Ohio before it closed. He knows what it's like to lose a good job with a living wage and good benefits to unfair foreign competition and to a trade policy and a tax policy that, putting it bluntly, sold out American workers. He knows what those job losses do to an entire community in a place like Hannibal. Donnie never gave up. He spent his life fighting for the dignity of work in Ohio and across the country, serving the members of Local 5724 in many roles, including 2 terms as its chair. And together we've worked to make progress to keep the level, to build and level the playing field for Ohio steelworkers. His current role as director of USW District 1, he was instrumental in establishing the free college benefit. Donnie Blatt has been a member of the Ohio AFL-CIO Executive Board since 2006. He became chairman of the legislative committee in 2019. We're lucky to have him here today. I'm proud and lucky to have him as a constituent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Donnie, welcome.
Thank you, Senator Brown. We look forward to working with you on these issues. Let me now give the background on the other witnesses in their order. Our first witness will be Mr. George Davis, Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at Intel. Our next witness will be Jonathan Jennings, Vice President of Global Commodity Purchasing and Supplier of Technical Assistance at the Ford Motor Company. Our third witness will be Jay Timmons, President and CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers. Our fourth witness will be Dr. Michelle Hanlon, who is the Howard W. Johnson Professor at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And our final witness has just been introduced by our friend, Senator Brown, Mr. Donnie Blatt, District Director for United Steelworkers, District 1. So let us begin then with you, Mr. Davis. You're on mute. How
about now?
Perfect.
Perfect. Too many mute buttons, apparently. Chairman Wyden and Ranking Member Crapo, thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today. Semiconductor technology and Intel's domestic R&D and manufacturing operations provide a critical foundation for U.S. economic and national security. More than 50 years ago, Intel invented the world's first commercial microprocessor. This fueled job growth and development of new technologies with major economic benefits. Today, Intel remains the only American semiconductor company that still designs and manufactures the most advanced logic chips and is the only company that has built leading-edge logic fabs in the U.S. in the past 5 years. I am proud that the majority of our manufacturing is conducted in Oregon, Arizona, and New Mexico, and that the majority of Intel's intellectual property still resides here at home. Unfortunately, U.S. leadership in semiconductor manufacturing is at risk. Global demand for semiconductors has increased dramatically, and is projected to grow 5% annually until 2030. However, only 12% of global semiconductor manufacturing is in the US, and just 9% is from American companies. Currently, 80% of the world's semiconductor manufacturing is concentrated in Asia. US manufacturing must regain its competitiveness. President Biden's executive order reinforces the urgency of funding the bipartisan CHIPS for America Act, led by Senators Cornyn and Warner. Their legislation recognizes the importance of using federal grants to support American workers and strengthen domestic semiconductor industry. Congress must now work to fully fund the grant program and enact its proposed investment tax credit. An investment tax credit would encourage long-term domestic semiconductor manufacturing. A single advanced logic manufacturing facility costs tens of billions of dollars to build and operate. Every advancement in chip design requires retooling and reinvesting in new equipment. Over the last decade, the average rate of chip manufacturing has grown 5 times faster overseas than in the US due to robust incentive programs offered by other countries. In fact, US companies face up to a 40% cost disadvantage compared to Asian competitors due largely to government incentives. Investment in research and development is critical to advance manufacturing. As President Biden acknowledged in his executive order, R&D is essential to sustain leadership in the development of critical goods and materials. However, without congressional action, 67 years of pro-R&D growth policy is about to be reversed. Starting next year, businesses will be required to amortize their R&D expenses over several years. Removing this deduction will make the US virtually the only developed country in the world with this policy. This change will significantly increase the cost to perform R&D in the US. We applaud the bipartisan work of Senators Hassan, Young, Cortez Masto, Portman, and Sass, whose bill, the American Innovation and Jobs Act, would prevent this regressive policy from taking place. Right now, the US is uncompetitive in attracting new semiconductor investments. Semiconductors are the building blocks of technology and must continually invest in R&D to enable chips to run faster and use less power. This is why Intel reinvests on average nearly 20% of its revenue into R&D, or about $13 billion annually. The CHIPS Act, along with the ability to fully deduct R&D expenses, will enable American companies to better compete with heavily subsidized foreign companies. The US is the birthplace of semiconductor and has always been a leader in semiconductor development. Investments in our industry will bolster manufacturing capabilities needed to strengthen the US economy and national security. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to working with you to advance these solutions and US technological leadership.
Davis, thank you. Our next witness will be Jonathan Jennings.
Thank you, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm honored to be representing the U.S. auto industry, which accounts for 18 million U.S. jobs. The manufacturers, suppliers, and dealers that make up this complex system pump $953 billion into the U.S. economy each year. It's especially meaningful to be testifying in front of not one but both of my home state senators, Portman and Brown, and Ford's home state senator, Stabenow. Our 53,000 Ford employees and more than 330,000 supplier and community partners are so fortunate to have you champion auto manufacturing in Washington. My career at Ford started in 1993 as a manufacturing engineer in Cleveland, Ohio. Since then, I've worked around the world for Ford, focusing on developing a well-tuned global supply chain. I'm speaking to you today as Ford's Vice President of Global Commodity Purchasing and Supplier Technical Assistance, which purchased more than $48 billion in goods and services from more than 5,000 U.S. suppliers in 46 states in 2019. At Ford, we see ourselves as America's automaker. We employ the most hourly U.S. auto workers, assemble more vehicles in the U.S., and export more vehicles from here than any other automaker. So we feel uniquely positioned to speak to the business environment needed to continue our winning strategy. We supported communities and families across this country for 117 years. When America has needed us to step up and aid the safety and security of the nation, we have responded. From World War II to this global pandemic, we've been on the front lines. Starting last year, Ford, along with our UAW partners, produced masks, reusable gowns, test collection kits, face shields, and ventilators to meet the COVID-19 emergency. Our ability to quickly shift from manufacturing vehicles to manufacturing personal protective equipment was largely because of our unique manufacturing footprint. Many of the suppliers we used to make face masks, respirators, and ventilators were already in our U.S. plants and warehouses. It's a case study in how powerful and responsive our industry can be if the materials and parts we need to build a new generation of vehicles are easily attainable. And that brings us to today. The global industry is driving a transportation revolution. The shift to electric vehicles will reduce our carbon footprint and change how auto manufacturers assemble vehicles. By 2040, more than half of the world's vehicles will be electric, and the vast majority of new cars sold will be electric. Right now, China is home to 73% of the worldwide capacity for lithium-ion batteries, followed by the US far behind in second place with 12%. This is simply unacceptable. Over the next few years, the growth in new manufacturing will be faster in Asia than in the US, further reducing our share of global battery manufacturing. Recently, we've seen a semiconductor shortage force production cutbacks throughout the industry. Even every auto company manufacturing in the US has had production impacted. Ford workers have seen weeks of suspended production at plants in Louisville, Chicago, and Dearborn, Michigan. The semiconductor situation underscores our supply chain risks. There are dangerous parallels to the way the electric vehicle batteries are sourced and developed. In short, we must collectively do more to protect the future of manufacturing in America. Ford has committed $22 billion to develop a new generation of electric vehicles and to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. Last year, we spent more than $5 billion in research and development in the US, representing 15,000 engineers and software developers, vehicle and powertrain prototypes, test labs, and equipment. That investment is reflected in the safety and connected vehicle technology you'll see in an all-electric version of our best-selling Transit commercial van, which is built in our Kansas City plant, and an all-electric version of our best-selling F-150 pickup, which is built in Dearborn. We've been clear and committed. The future is electric, and the future must include America. For the U.S. auto sector to succeed, we'll need Congress and the administration to support market-based consumer and manufacturing incentives, innovative new technology, labor and plant transitions, and supply chain security. We appreciate Senator Stabenow's leadership, and not just as a champion for expanding the electric vehicle consumer tax credit, but for her recent introduction of the American Jobs and Energy Manufacturing Act. We embrace the proposal by President Biden that would provide a 10% advanceable tax credit for companies creating U.S. manufacturing jobs. We also support increasing existing R&D incentives for advanced battery and electric vehicle development and continued immediate expensing of R&D. Together, public and private support of electrification will ensure America not only competes as a leader globally, but wins. This is particularly important as Europe and China are already moving forward with robust electric vehicle adoption strategies and policies. We at Ford stand ready to work with this committee, Congress, and the administration on efforts to not only deliver world-class electric vehicles, but transition the supply chain and infrastructure to assure future economic and transportation stability and security for America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jennings. Our next witness will be Mr. Jay Timmons.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, I'm joining you virtually because of the pandemic that this country has endured for more than a year now. But this pandemic is really far more than a story of economic hardship and painful loss. It's also a story of communities and companies rising to the challenge. America's manufacturing workers mobilized in ways reminiscent of their resolve during World War II, when manufacturers became the arsenal of democracy. And the companies joining me today are part of this effort. You've already heard from Ford and how they remade shop floors to make ventilators and face shields. You've heard from Intel that accelerated access to technology to combat this pandemic. From iconic global brands to family-owned shops, manufacturers answered the call. Today, 1 year after health restrictions began, the light at the end of the tunnel is growing brighter by the second, thanks to the innovation of pharmaceutical manufacturers. Their heroic work, combined with the previous administration's Operation Warp Speed and this Congress and this administration's focus on and investment in vaccine distribution, is now saving about 2 million American lives every single day. Manufacturing workers' achievements are all the more impressive when you consider the disruptions that they had to overcome. The pandemic exposed and exacerbated, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, serious supply chain issues that we must now address as we work to build the next post-pandemic world. In the spring of 2020, the National Association of Manufacturers released our plan for strengthening manufacturing supply chains, and I've had the opportunity to discuss it directly with some of you. Our goal is your goal, ensuring that the next dollar invested in manufacturing is invested right here in America. This plan is comprehensive, from taxes to workforce. The central premise is that incentives, not punitive measures, will allow us to achieve our shared goal. Now, let me call out 3 key recommendations. Number 1, we must recognize the importance of predictability and stability in the tax code. Tax reform made manufacturers more competitive, driving historic job creation, wage growth, and productivity in its immediate aftermath. So let's not undo that progress. Number 2, manufacturers in America can only remain at the cutting edge if our tax code supports innovation. You've already heard this from 2 of the other panelists. Unfortunately, it will do just the opposite starting next year. And that looming change to the tax treatment of research costs will make it more expensive to perform research and development, potentially costing America its innovative edge. And number 3, let's recognize a simple truth. Policies that are successful in growing manufacturing will require significant capital expenditures by the small and medium-sized firms that are truly the backbone of the domestic supply chain. But 2 other looming changes to the tax code will make those expenditures difficult. More stringent limitations on interest deductions and the phase out of immediate expenses will take effect in the years ahead. And if not revised, these changes will make it hard to grow manufacturing here at home. Ultimately, ensuring that the next manufacturing dollar is invested right here in America requires looking at the entire business climate. And that means that this Congress will have to address other pressing questions as well. Will tax rates for businesses of all sizes remain competitive, or better yet, become more competitive so that we can keep attracting investment? Will the regulatory system provide certainty and clarity? Will healthcare become more affordable without compromising free market principles? Will this nation finally make bold investments in infrastructure that are long overdue? Will energy be abundant, affordable, and reliable? Will export opportunities increase while we enforce our existing trade agreements to protect American workers? And will we achieve comprehensive immigration reform to ensure that those hidden in the shadows or brought here as children can become permanent, productive members of our society? Now, if the answer to those questions is yes, if we tackle these fundamental issues, then I am certain that this next world that we're building in the aftermath of the pandemic will be built by American workers in American factories, restoring American leadership in the world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is Dr. Michelle Hanlon.
Thank you, and good morning. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this hearing. It's an honor to be here. I have 3 points I'd like to make, and then I look forward to any questions that you might have. First, maintaining a competitive corporate statutory income tax rate is an important tax policy objective. As Ranking Member Crapo said in his opening remarks, prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, or the TCJA, the U.S. had a 35% corporate income tax rate. It was one of the highest rates in the world. That high corporate income tax rate, along with our international tax regime that we had prior to the TCJA, led to many negative economic outcomes. For example, there were incentives to move profits to foreign locations. There were incentives to retain high cash holdings in foreign subsidiaries. And in particular, for this hearing, is that in some cases, our prior tax system led to strong incentives to manufacture outside of the US. Currently, our federal corporate statutory income tax rate is 21%. According to the OECD data, our rate, including state and local income taxes, is estimated to be 25.8%. The OECD average is 23.3%, and the G20 average is 26.9%. Thus, we now have a competitive domestic corporate income tax rate, but we are by no means a tax haven. My co-authors and I recently surveyed some US companies about the TCJA. We find that almost 90% of the C corporations that responded to the survey said that the lower corporate tax rate was important to their company. Indeed, the corporate rate reduction was the provision of the TCJA that received the highest importance rating in our survey. Furthermore, of the companies that said that they increased investment in response to the TCJA, many said they did so because of the reduction in the corporate tax rate. There are certainly tax and non-tax factors that go into company decisions. In terms of tax policy, in my opinion, it is very important that we endeavor to maintain a competitive corporate tax rate in order to incentivize economic activity here at home and to avoid the negative economic consequences from the pre-TCJA era. My second point is that in addition to competitive tax rates, targeted tax incentives are often desirable. For example, the R&D tax credit and the immediate expensing of R&D costs, as we just heard. R&D is vitally important in the manufacturing sector. The latest data from the IRS are for 2014, and those data show that the manufacturing industry claimed nearly 60% of the research credits claimed by corporations. The academic research consistently finds evidence that the R&D credit works, meaning that it increases research and development spending, and moreover, the evidence is consistent with the increased spending being greater than the cost to the Treasury. There are also other situations where there might be societal or strategic reasons to provide targeted tax incentives for certain activities or industries. For example, green energy tax incentives. Another example are tax incentives to address concerns about the lack of supply and manufacturing of certain goods in the US, in particular semiconductors. An investment tax credit has been proposed, as we have heard from other witnesses, as part of the CHIPS Act. It's a sizable credit, 40% in the first year, and based on the academic research of other investment tax credits, it would likely help to incentivize investment in that activity. However, I want to point out that it's important to remain cognizant that the overall tax system needs to remain competitive for these temporary incentives to be most effective. Third, and somewhat related to what I just mentioned, is that looking forward, it is important to consider the entirety of the tax system in terms of already scheduled tax changes and proposed tax changes that will affect and possibly offset some of the investment incentives that we have in the code. For example, in terms of changes that are scheduled to occur in the TCJA legislation, bonus depreciation will soon start phasing out, and R&D expenditures will be required to be capitalized and amortized rather than expensed. Both of these changes will weaken the investment incentives in the current tax code. In terms of proposed tax changes, President Biden's tax plans include raising the corporate tax rate and the resurrection of an alternative minimum tax, this time based on financial accounting earnings. I have already discussed some of the risks of an uncompetitive corporate tax rate. The proposed AMT is concerning for several reasons, but most importantly for this hearing is that such a policy can offset the targeted tax incentives. The investment incentives are not present in financial accounting income because financial accounting income is intended for a different purpose. Thus, enacting an AMT and computing the AMT base using financial accounting income will serve to weaken the investment incentives in the tax code. Thank you again for inviting me to participate in this hearing. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hanlon. Our final witness will be Mr. Donnie Blatt.
Good morning, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee. I was very honored to be introduced by my good friend, Senator Sherrod Brown. As you know, he spent his career working, supporting workers in the United States in support of U.S. manufacturing, and also trying to repeal provisions of the current tax law that would reward offshoring of good-paying manufacturing jobs. So I appreciated his introduction. As a member of the largest industrial union in North America and representing workers across our nation's economy, manufacturing jobs are important to the local tax base and to build strong communities. For these reasons, Congress and the administration should use all the tools available to retain and grow manufacturing jobs and domestic supply chains, including U.S. tax policy. As the committee considers the effects of the U.S. tax code on manufacturing, we need to make sure that domestic manufacturers and their workers are able to compete globally and able to make products for important supply chains. This starts with better understanding of our supply chains and improving our procurement policies. The tax code could be used strategically to drive investment in industrial facilities. Capital investments in facilities are expensive and are expected to last for decades, but that upfront capital is hard to come by, especially during a recession. Our union certainly has had success stories where our employers have taken advantage of tax credits to ensure that our members' jobs continue. One example is a company named Roadtech in Aurora, Ohio, which upgraded its facility from the 2009 48C tax credit. Our members there continue to make large diameter slewing bearings and seamless forged rings for the oil, gas, mining, and wind energy industries. We support the revival of the expansion of the 48C tax credit with an emphasis on the communities with significant job losses. It is also important that we put our tax code in perspective with the globe and that we protect against unnecessary tax-based erosion. We need to ensure that tax revenues allow the government to rebuild our infrastructure, invest in our workers, and provide for our security. Meanwhile, we need to improve our tax code to discourage outsourcing and profit shifting of low tax jurisdictions. We should also increase transparency. The quest to build out domestic supply chains for critical technologies will only be successful if we also use policy levers to ensure that domestic manufacturers have customers who make long-term commitments. Our union can provide many examples of U.S. companies whose prices are illegally undercut by foreign competitors. Our trade laws need reform, but so do our industrial policies that have not successfully created markets for domestic manufacturers on a large enough scale. For example, the bulk components of new energy technologies come from overseas, yet companies like USW Representative Sharon Tube and Thomas Strip Steel can make components for solar and battery technology, despite both being nearly 100 years old. I am confident that U.S. manufacturers can and would innovate as long as they have customers. As we look at the expansion of new technologies, the federal government has a big role to play in the build out of supply chains and making sure that we retain existing supply chains. For example, USW members at Warren Coke have long provided product to Cleveland Cliffs, where our members make lightweight steel that goes into fuel-efficient automobiles. As car companies work to meet their climate commitments, federal policy should ensure that we gain rather than lose jobs in the auto supply chain. The USW has been a long supporter of Buy America policies and federal procurement for infrastructure as a way to build markets and to ensure that federal money is spent to support American workers. It only makes sense that American workers benefit from projects funded by American tax dollars. These principles are broadly popular. We encourage Congress to ensure that federal spending in the form of tax credits is used to benefit industries and companies that drive economic recovery in America and grow our manufacturing base. In conclusion, well-paid union American manufacturing workers are critical to our economy. We can see that evidenced in hometowns across our country. I thank you for the opportunity to share how important it is for Congress to use many tools, including tax policy, to grow a globally competitive manufacturing base. And I look forward to your questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blatt. And I want to thank all our panel members. I think we're going to have a good discussion with the committee. Let me start with you, if I might, Mr. Blatt. It seems to me you don't grow high-skill, high-wage jobs by osmosis. And the situation here is really urgent. If there's more kind of dawdling around, we're not going to see those good jobs in Oregon and Ohio and all the states that my colleagues represent. So the way we're looking at it is there is a real jobs creation toolkit for reshoring and bolstering American manufacturing. What would be the most important step, in your view, that the Finance Committee could take as it tries to use that toolkit to shore up American jobs?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator Wyden. And I believe that in our view, that one of the most important steps that we can do is to make sure that we create incentives for manufacturers to create jobs here in this country and keep people from moving offshore with the tax policies that we currently have. If we don't take action to bolster manufacturing in the U.S., that just means more jobs are going to be in China and not in Ohio or in Oregon or other parts of the country.
Good. Let me go to you, Mr. Davis, if I might. I want to start by talking about the short-sightedness of American tax policy, because if you look at the recent past, Congress will throw another tax extender out there. We create all these fiscal cliffs, but it doesn't make it possible for you as a company to have the certainty and predictability you need to grow jobs. And this short-sightedness includes what I consider to be a truly bizarre decision made by my Republican friends who nearly 4 years ago decided to put incentives for research and innovation on the chopping block so they could squeeze out their 2017 tax bill through something called reconciliation. So here's my question. I think the last thing we need for Intel, which employs so many, Oregonians and other Americans, is more short-term tax policy. I think our competitors can really lap us in this competitive race if we go that route, and we'll just keep bleeding if we keep throwing these short-term Band-Aids at it and end up in a kind of cul-de-sac where we're even in worse shape than we are now. Would it be fair to say that it's the position you're talking about today that our chip manufacturers need to have a long-term strategy if we're going to get out of this cul-de-sac?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I think you're spot on, and also thank you for your support in Oregon. It is a wonderful place to have so much of our activity based. I think both of the issues that we're talking about today, both the R&D issue around deductibility and the investment tax credit, are very important issues for long-term stability and for attracting investment. R&D is about 2.8% of GDP today. About for every $1 billion, and there's about $500 billion of R&D spent in the U.S. today, over 70% of which is from the private sector. But every $1 billion equals about 17,000 jobs. So I think the American Innovation and Jobs Act is very aptly named. We agree that changing R&D from deductibility to amortization is a very regressive step, and one we would very much discourage. It would also reverse 67 years of policy that has allowed the deductibility of R&D. And as you know, this is in no small part a major contributor to why U.S. leads in so many areas from technology, and we can't take for granted the impact that this would have on both jobs and the continuing innovation in the country. On the investment tax credit for semiconductors, but for so many other industries as well, the investments that we have to make are in the billions of dollars, and they take place over many years. So having a policy that encourages long-term investment and is stable so people can have confidence that if they make the decision to invest more in critical areas in the U.S., in our case, in in semiconductors, that we can count on the same types of incentives that are allowing our foreign competitors to operate at a much lower cost.
All right, thank you, Mr. Davis. I want to ask one other question real quickly. Mr. Ford, you all and other automakers are making a transition to electric vehicles, a very constructive step. I don't want us to end up being reliant on China for batteries. And, you know, a lot of people who are looking at the big challenge think that as we shift to a all electric future, what can we do to make sure that we're going to have those batteries? Because I think they're going to play a enormously important role in the future. Can you give us a quick answer?
Yes, so thank you for the question, Chairman Wyden. I would say there's really three key steps that we could take. The first of which has been mentioned earlier, and that is we need to ensure that we don't incentivize, that we do not disincentivize companies from pursuing this R&D, because it is so critical, by taking away the ability to deduct those R&D expenses. The second is actually doubling down on those targeted areas for incentives around electrification, around advanced mobility. But thirdly, and probably most importantly in this area of batteries, how do we also look at cash back for the credits that have been identified? This especially would be true for companies that are going through startup and the companies that actually need the money now. How can we actually get the cash back for those credits now to enable them to, again, pursue further investment in reference to R&D, again, at a time when they need it at this point?
Thank you. I'm over my time. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Professor Hanlon, I'll start out with you today. In your testimony, you noted that targeted tax credits for strategic industries can be effective and that we should protect them. But you made a very strong case, I think, that using a relatively high corporate tax rate to offset them would not be good policy. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure, and thank you for the question. The corporate income tax is generally thought to be an inefficient tax in the sense that it causes a lot of distortions. In fact, the OECD has called the corporate income tax the most harmful form of taxation for economic growth because it discourages job creation and investment. Thus, having a competitive corporate tax rate is important so that the distortionary effects are not too large or too detrimental. And I think, we already ran the experiment to some degree of having the highest tax rate in the world, and the outcomes were not good.
Well, thank you very much. And Mr. Davis, let me move to you on the same question. You've noted very, very effectively the power of targeted industry-specific tax incentives and the dangers that we see of some of those expiring soon. And my chairman, Senator Wyden, correctly noted that they are expiring because of the Reconciliation Act, which has a 10-year limitation on it, or other provisions that were required in order to meet the requirements of the Reconciliation Act. I think there's bipartisan agreement that we should not see those expire. In fact, some of the legislation I referenced in my opening statement does exactly that on a very bipartisan basis. But could you comment on the notion that we are hearing that the making of those tax credits permanent and adding maybe even additional tax credits that are needed and important on an industry-specific basis could be offset or should be offset by increasing the general corporate tax rate?
Senator Crapo, first off, thank you for your leadership for many years in the semi industry, and certainly the success of Micron is in no small part to your leadership, and we appreciate that. The idea of having an incentive to create outcomes that you want is a pretty accepted concept, and we want to ensure that we have incentives for R&D in the U.S. to be competitive with R&D anywhere else in the world, and we have for 67 years. We've assured that in the way we've approached it, and I think it's very encouraging to see bipartisan support for not ending that and for getting that after that in the areas that we talked about. For investment tax credits, I can speak to the semiconductor industry, and I know you've seen it as well over the years. We have not had a stable incentive for manufacturing semiconductors in the U.S. for a very long time. Whereas it has been a significant focus of a number of countries, particularly in Asia, who view semiconductors as a foundational technology, both for economic expansion and their own national security. So since 1990, semiconductor manufacturing in the US was about 37% of the worldwide manufacturing. Today, it is 12%, and it's on a path by 2030 to be 10%. At the same time, you've seen a massive expansion in Asia. In China has gone from 1% to 15% of the world semiconductor manufacturing over that same period, and they're on a track to be at roughly 25% by 2030. And these trends really reflect the difference of having stable long-term incentives to grow capability in the foreign locations that create a significant cost advantage for semiconductor expansion in Asia as opposed to in the US. So I think as we think about investment tax credits, it would be great to be able to have a sustainable strategy to reverse the trend.
Thank you very much. And you make a strong case for having sustainable long-term tax policy in the tax credit system. And Mr. Timmons, we're running short on time, but could you just respond to the notion that as we seek to have that stable long-term investment policy in our tax credit system, that we not make a mistake of thinking that we should raise the corporate tax rates at the same time?
Well, Senator, I can tell you that one of the strongest actions that Congress has taken in the last few years has been to reduce the corporate tax rate, as well as pass-through rates for S-corps. And what I hear when I talk to manufacturers all around the country is that tax reform actually supercharged these companies' ability to invest in America, hire American workers, and raise wages and benefits.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for hosting what I consider to be an incredibly important hearing. I don't believe that we have an economy unless somebody makes something and somebody grows something, and that's what we're talking about here, is our capacity to make things in America. And there's no reason, if we have the right set of policies, that we can't do that. That's incredibly important in Michigan, as you can imagine, as well as the whole country. And it's an area where it's a very, very high priority for me, what we're talking about today. I also want to thank all of the wonderful witnesses that are testifying today, and particularly Jonathan Jennings from Michigan's own Ford Motor Company, known for their commitment to U.S. manufacturing. And a big thank you, Jonathan, for the incredible work when Ford stepped up to really help us deal with the medical supply chain needs, PPE, and so on during the pandemic. Really, really extraordinary. The U.S. is a global clean energy country that is in a race right now. We're in a race. We know $100 billion has already been put in that race by China for electrification. We know the investments that are going on around the world. We've already talked about today about the capacity of China now around lithium-ion batteries, as well as solar panels and other things, because of the investments that they have made. And also our U.S. supply chain vulnerabilities really are happening right now, today. In Michigan, there are layoffs right now as a result of this semiconductor chip that comes from one plant in Taiwan. And we certainly can't allow that to continue. So I appreciate all of my colleagues and Mr. Chairman, your comments. And we've got a lot to do together. And I just want to, before asking a question, throw out the 48C, which I was proud to author a number of years ago. So pleased to see everyone embracing the bipartisan effort we have to reconstitute the 30% tax credit for clean energy manufacturing in the United States, and appreciate Senator Manchin and Senator Daines partnering on this. Also, Mr. Chairman, anxious to work with you and all of our colleagues on the bipartisan efforts for other incentives to invest in U.S. manufacturing of semiconductor components, batteries, solar panels. There's just no reason that we can't have those things made in America. And finally, I do have to put in a plug when we're talking about electrification, that we need to be passing new legislation to expand and reform the consumer tax credit 30D, which is based on what Senator Alexander and I did in a bipartisan bill last Congress. So we've got to be doing that as well. So Mr. Jennings, two questions. With EVs only accounting for about 2% of the vehicle market today, can you talk about why it is so important to continue and expand the consumer tax credit? And also, secondly, how does that work in tandem with domestic manufacturing incentives like 48C to increase the component parts we need here in the U.S.?
First, Senator Stabenow, it's again a pleasure to see you, especially in this forum. Specific to the question around in the reference to the 2%, we know that the Americans are taking advantage of the EV consumer tax credit today. And we believe in order for us to keep that momentum, we have to look at that additional 400,000 units that I believe your 2019 legislation had proposed. So for us, that is a key item that we need to continue on to continue to grow on that 2% that you have mentioned. In reference to the consumer tax credit and the manufacturing credit, we actually see that as a 1-2 punch, right? In order for us to enable us to really continue on with the innovation, with the investment that we have in the infrastructure, that again will, with those align with the other incentives, really puts us in a position to be more competitive globally.
Great. Thank you so much for all your leadership. And then quickly before my time runs out, Mr. Platt, thank you. Mr. Platt, you are a wonderful leader of our steel workers. So I'm so grateful for your endorsement of our 48C bill and for all that our skilled workers do in America. And we need more jobs, as you know, for our skilled workers, good paying jobs. But I wonder if you might speak a little bit more about making things in America. Pleased to have introduced a bipartisan bill called Make It in America Act to close the loopholes in Buy American laws so we can be using our purchasing power to a greater extent to help drive the market. Could you take just a moment to speak about why you think it's so important that we do that?
Absolutely, Senator Stabenow. Thank you very much for the question. And by the way, we support the Made in America Act, and as a union, we appreciate your work in that area as well. But look, investing in America and investing in American manufacturing creates jobs, and it allows for our manufacturers to not only hire more people but expand their businesses. And whenever our manufacturers expand, it helps our communities. It creates other jobs within the communities. At Ormat, when I worked at Ormat, I know that for one job at Ormat, it supplied 6 other jobs out in the community in the county where that manufacturing was, and that is true everywhere in this country. So having a Buy America provision is there's no sector worker that can't be touched by that and can't be made better because we have these types of provisions.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the 4th minute, I'm going to ask one question of Ms. Hanlon and Ms. Timmons, but I want to say something. First of all, I appreciate your holding our hearing, and it's very important that we have strong domestic manufacturing, and that's very important for our economy, very important for our national security. This was a significant motivation behind our pro-growth tax reforms in 2017. These reforms were designed to encourage business investment at home and increase our competitiveness abroad. The key features include reducing our corporate tax rate to 35% because it was the highest in the developed world. We moved that down to 21%. For those that like to point to Scandinavian economies as a model, our 21% is just 1 percentage point lower than Denmark and Norway, and less than 1/2 point lower than Sweden. Just as important for our many manufacturers that operate in pass-through form, the individual rates were lowered, and an innovative deduction was for qualified business income was enacted to help those people in the 2017 tax reductions. We also modernized America's international tax system to bring it more in line with other developed countries. These rules make U.S. companies more competitive in the worldwide marketplace and incentivize them to grow their businesses here at home. This means more jobs, better wages, and increased investment. And central to our mission to encourage greater investment in the United States, enhanced expensing rules were included. This encourages our manufacturers to invest in new equipment and machines that help boost productivity. Combine these and other reforms have made the U.S. a more attractive place to locate a new facility and expand an existing one. As a result, in 2018, manufacturers created the most new jobs in over 20 years. And in 2019, manufacturing capital expenditures reached an all-time high. Our mission must be to build on this success through a continuation of our pro-growth tax policies. And with that being said, I want to ask the one question that I said to Ms. Hanlon and to Mr. Timmons. The administration has proposed tax increases on U.S. businesses, increasing the corporate tax rate to 28%, raising taxes on pass-through businesses through raising the individual rates, imposing a corporate alternative minimum tax, doubling the tax rates on foreign subsidiaries, and I could make a much longer list. But to speed things up, I want to refer to something that members of the Biden administration have said, particularly Secretary of Treasury Yellen, to justify these tax increases on producers by arguing that when coupled with other parts of the administration's economic agendas, such as investments in infrastructure, their proposals will, quote, make our economy more productive, end of quote. In your view, is spending on infrastructure a fair substitute for low tax rates and an overall internationally competitive tax system? Whichever the two of you want to start, and then when that person's done, just go to the other person.
Sure, I'm happy to start, Senator, and thank you for the question. As I said in my opening statement, we've seen enormous investment and job growth here in this country as a result of tax reform. It is the reason that we supported it, and it was the reason we were calling for it for several decades. In fact, after we achieved and Congress passed that legislation, we said that it's now on us to show that we're keeping our promises to invest and hire and grow wages and benefits. But we have a document, Keeping Our Promises, that I'll make sure that you have a copy of, that outlines some of the great success stories of tax reform. I think of Jameson Door, that gave their 120 employees special bonuses and invested in a new manufacturing space, 50,000 square feet. Marlin Steel Wire Products invested $1.5 million in new technology, and they increased their full-time workforce by 30%. Carpenter Technologies Corporation, $100 million investment. Those are small manufacturers. And there are larger manufacturers that have done some amazing things as well. $400 million investment from a Midwest manufacturer. Higher wages from, significantly higher wages from manufacturers in Indiana and Ohio. $1 billion investment from a beverage manufacturer in a southern state. Those are the types of positive benefits that came from tax reform. Now, there are some issues that have to be resolved. We're here today to talk about some of those on the research and development side and on the investment and interest deductibility side. But all in all, Senator, the work that was achieved then has led to some really positive results.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things to that. I think raising tax rates now would be a mistake. If we raise our corporate tax rate to 28%, then our combined rate will be 32 to 33%. That will again be the highest corporate tax rate in the OECD. And I think that would be a big mistake. It will put us at a competitive disadvantage in many respects that we already mentioned, many of us on this panel today.
Thank you, Ms. Hanlon. Senator Cantwell's turn next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you and Ranking Member for holding this important hearing. It's interesting, we've just been in the Energy Committee having a similar conversation about electric vehicles and the United States competitiveness as it relates to manufacturing. But I wanted to ask Mr. Jennings, Ford and obviously other US manufacturers are trying to fight climate change and be competitive in a basically very international competitive market. But we have this issue with SK lithium ion batteries in Georgia, where Ford was going to do the Ford 150 program. And obviously with the USMCA 75% threshold mark, that would mean practically nearly impossible to meet that without producing those batteries in the United States. So I wanted to ask you ask you why this 4%, 4 years isn't long enough to get the SK batteries actually built there. And what does that mean for the Ford program? What does it mean for your ability to do production in the United States?
Thank you for the question. And to your point, the F-150 is a critical product for us. And specifically in reference to the 4 years, why does it take the 4 years that was referenced? The batteries are the fundamental foundation of electric vehicles. And the development of those battery cells and battery packs take approximately 4 years. Additionally, the building of a new electric vehicle facility also takes about 4 years. So we would have to be working with a supplier to simultaneously be developing that battery cell, that battery pack, along with the building of the actual facility. In reference to what this is actually doing in light of not having other battery cell providers available in the US, we've not been able to confirm that there is capacity currently available. We will now have to resort to looking at foreign suppliers to potentially import, which to your exact point, would not be compliant to USMC. So that's why we really feel it's critical for us to have a more competitive position within the US footprint.
Thank you. So literally we have to get this dispute resolved, really what it comes down to.
Absolutely. And to that point, what we've consistently stated is that we really encourage the Korean government to work with these two companies to resolve this even prior to the 60-day USTR timing. They need to come to an amicable agreement between the two.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Timmons, I wanted to ask you about another transportation sector, the aviation transportation sector. We've seen tremendous job loss, tens of thousands of jobs because of obviously the COVID pandemic and the decline of demand in the sector. Yet we seem poised, if you've seen the numbers on aviation transportation of late, we seem to be returning to aviation sector. What do we need to do to make sure that we keep a skilled aviation supply chain in the United States?
Well, I would say, Senator, I would say one thing that we need to do to make sure that we get the travel and hospitality industry up and running again overall is to make sure that we're all promoting vaccine acceptance. This pin, you're going to actually receive one fairly soon, displays a red and yellow ribbon that encourages vaccines throughout our country, and we're very proud to be leading that effort. I will say also that that tax incentives that are targeted toward workforce training and development are extremely important. It was part of our onshoring plan that we released last year that I referenced in my opening statements, and other programs that will also help to upskill and future-proof our workforce that can be supported by the government, but also, most notably, are promoted by the private sector. I think of actually Boeing, and I know that there is a connection there for you. I think of Boeing and the work that they do in supporting community colleges and technical schools where they actually have on-the-ground training for some of their future workforce. I've had a chance to see some of those programs in action, and they're phenomenal. We can support those types of programs through appropriate tax incentives and other programs.
Thank you. And thank you. And Mr. Davis, just one last thing on the supply chain as it relates to you. What do we need to do on the material side for the shortage that we're seeing in silicon? One of the things we just talked about in the Energy Committee was why the DOE needs to do more on actual recycling of material, that's something the United States could help in the immediate supply efforts.
I think what we've seen this year, Senator Cantwell, is remarkable demand swings, and certainly automotive has been one of the most impacted. First, a large decrease in demand followed by a very strong ramp up. But we've also seen in the semiconductor industry a very large expansion in demand as people are working from home. The way they interact with each other and the way they purchase has created tremendous pressure on the semiconductor, the whole ecosystem, not only materials, but component parts like substrates, Wi-Fi elements. So it's really about incentive, the expansion of the supply chain ecosystem to support semiconductors. One of the things that we see today is, like we said, we're at about 12% manufacturing in the US for semiconductors. Aerospace, which we were talking about, is 50% in the US. So we're at, and so we're highly dependent on foreign suppliers. And it was mentioned the supplier in Taiwan that has created some of the shortages as well. So I think incentive, the expansion of the supply chain, expansion of manufacturing in the U.S., which I know is being looked at, and certainly the CHIPS Act is a really positive step in that regard. Is a good first step.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, we're definitely very proud of that 50% supply chain in the U.S. in aerospace. And we certainly want U.S. manufacturers in the chip fabrication business to have supply and material. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying that tax reform cut taxes for families, double the child tax credit, nearly double the standard deduction. It also lowered tax rates across the board for small, medium-sized businesses, farms, and ranches, lowered corporate tax rate, which up until January was the highest corporate rate in the developed world. And as a result of that, incomes were rising, and up until the pandemic, the economy was on solid footing. Tax reform also improved the business environment for U.S. manufacturers, in particular with a lowered business rate, easier access to foreign cash, and more favorable expensing for capital acquisition. So I'd like to direct this question to Mr. Timmons and or Dr. Hanlon. The first question is, how is tax reform American manufacturers and its workers, namely when it comes to jobs, wages, and benefits? And then secondly, has tax reform helped U.S. manufacturers better compete against their global counterparts?
I went first last time, Michelle, so if you want to go first, I'll yield the floor.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the tax reform clearly was an improvement, and I think it clearly made our manufacturers more competitive. It provided incentives to not ship manufacturing offshore, but it did help create incentives to maintain manufacturing here. And so I think it's a clear improvement. I think, there's things we can do to build upon the TCJA and improve it further. One of those things would be to give manufacturers some certainty that these provisions will stay in place. So, for example, the FDII provisions, if we can give them certainty that something like that will stay in place for a while, and the low tax rate, I think that will help to strengthen these incentives going forward.
And I would echo that sentiment, Senator, as well. I can give you a couple of examples that where manufacturers, and these happen to be smaller manufacturers, small, mid-sized SMEs, that have actually brought production back to the United States or to the United States. Kentucky-based Big Ass Fans, for instance, they moved production jobs from Malaysia to the United States. They're based in Kentucky. I think I may have said that. Tennessee-based Bobrick washroom equipment, they moved production for their North American product lines to Jacksonville, Tennessee. Those are just a couple of examples. But I mentioned before several examples of investments that small, medium, and larger manufacturers have made since tax reform took effect. These resulted in billions of dollars of investment in plants and equipment here in the United States. And in addition, hiring American workers and raising wages and benefits. But I think what Ms. Hanlon mentioned is extraordinarily important. Businesses, manufacturers absolutely need predictability and stability in the tax code. And we would ask this committee and your colleagues to recognize that fact. And quite honestly, increasing the tax burden, regardless of the objective, will harm the ability of manufacturers to grow and compete in the modern economy. We do have some issues to address. That's those bills that we're talking about today can actually make us even more competitive. But to your question, Senator, those reforms were very important to supercharging investment and job creation here in the United States.
Okay. And just to give you an example, I mean, if you look at how, back in the early days, there were about 40% of American workers were in ag, and at the beginning of the 20th century, it was about 2%. The 2% today produce significantly more than the earlier 40%. The same thing has happened, I think, in American manufacturing, which peaked in 1944 at 39% of the labor force. Has been on decline since then. It's about 8.5% in 2017. What that means, obviously, in part at least, is that the United States manufacturing activities become more productive, specialized, and high tech. These advances have potential to transform fundamentally the nature of work, commerce, and manufacturing. With that in mind, what tax policies can best position America's manufacturers and workers to compete in the modern economy? I would ask that again to Mr. Timmons. And yeah.
Sure. So,
Mr. Timmons.
So one of the reasons, obviously, that we're here today, Senator, is to talk about research costs, the amortization that will occur if there are not improvements made. We're very excited about this bill. We want to make sure that research and development costs remain a deduction. We believe that there needs to be a broad-based investment tax credit. We're talking about some tax credits here today as well. But in our strengthening the manufacturing supply chain proposals that we released last year, we called for a broad-based investment tax credit to encourage new domestic investments in manufacturing. And then, as I mentioned in an earlier question that Senator Cantwell proposed, incentives to help companies recruit, train, and retain skilled workers in order to help build a pipeline of workers with the skills needed for a modern manufacturing facility. It's hard to believe after this pandemic, but manufacturers today have 515,000 open jobs that we cannot fill because we can't find folks with the skills necessary. What we want to do is we want to train existing workers, train new workers, and upskill those workers to future-proof their jobs.
We got 17 senators still waiting. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My home state of New Jersey has long been at the forefront of innovation, from telecom to electricity to pharmaceutical innovations of today. Indeed, one of the 3 COVID-19 vaccines being used nationwide today comes from a New Jersey-based company. We manufacture more than $52 billion worth of products a year. We support 247,000 jobs with an average pay of about $92,000. So those are significant, but technology and manufacturing are changing rapidly. And it seems to me that we need to look forward to the future of manufacturing and ensure that America is where that manufacturing occurs. Something I've been looking at is what role Congress can play in fostering the next generation of advanced manufacturing to ensure the jobs of the future are created here in the United States. And I believe we need to invest in our world-leading university system and develop public-private partnerships between universities and the private sector. I'm looking forward to working with my Republican colleagues on the committee to draft legislation that would establish centers of excellence to incubate advanced manufacturing processes that would enable us to outcompete China and the rest of the world. So, Mr. Timmons, can you speak to the importance of leveraging our research university system to foster advanced manufacturing in order to be competitive in the years ahead?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Senator. You're absolutely correct. If you think in terms of the work that we can achieve at our four-year institutions, and I would say that I've seen some amazing work being done at other schools as well. You marry that hand in glove with research and development tax credit and the ability to deduct that on an annual basis. You continue to strengthen our capabilities as the leading innovative nation in the world. And innovation is frankly the lifeblood of manufacturing. You've already heard some statistics coming from Mr. Davis and others about how incredibly that research and development truly is the lifeblood of our economy, and that we lead the world. We want to continue to develop our footprint in the R&D space, and we can do that through partnerships with institutions of higher education.
It seems to me, hearing the number of jobs that you say exist and however are going unfulfilled, that in addition to the type of training programs you're talking about, we should be marrying our community college and other institutions to look at the skill sets that are needed in this regard in order to fulfill the goals.
Yes, sir.
Let me turn to the shortages of personal protective equipment that persisted throughout much of the last year, that revealed the vulnerability of our medical supply chain. States were forced into bidding wars against each other and chaos ensued. The frontline heroes of the crisis, our healthcare workers, risked their lives day in and day out and were compelled to use the same PPE shift after shift. Life-saving drugs and ventilators had to be rationed, creating an impossible choice between hospitals, long-term care facilities, and nursing homes. And so I believe we can never be held again hostage to foreign manufacturers. I understand we're going to live in a global economy and a global supply chain, but for such critical medical supplies, I think that there's a better way. So I have developed bipartisan legislation with Senator Wicker to incentivize medical supply manufacturing in Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States as a commonwealth. Our legislation would provide U.S. companies with a credit against the GILTI tax based on the amount of manufacturing and job creation they undertake in the territories, which wouldn't be a giveaway. Rather, it's tied directly to wages and tangible investment in the territories. Mr. Black, can you speak to how the loss of domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity created supply chain vulnerabilities that the pandemic exposed?
Yes, thank you, Senator Menendez. Actually, we are losing a pharmaceutical manufacturer that we represent in West Virginia, not in Ohio, but Mylan. that is going out of business, and that's 1,000 jobs that are lost. We struggled with personal protective equipment all over the state of Ohio and all over this country for our members during the pandemic. I believe that's critically important to get that supply chain back, to make sure that, not even when we're in this pandemic, but whenever we need protective equipment, that our workers and our members can get those supplies. And it's critically important to our economy to make sure that we have a good supply chain for domestic pharmaceuticals and protective equipment suppliers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. Senator Portman.
Appreciate your holding the hearing. It's very timely, and I thank you for inviting so many Ohioans to join us. Jay Timmons, Jonathan Jennings, thank you guys for being here. And Donnie Blatt, I appreciate your being on today and appreciate working with you and your team and all of your locals, including some good successes with Piketon, with Cooper Tire, most recently with Cleveland Cliffs, saved a bunch of jobs, and your support for our Made in America bills, including some recent legislation we've introduced on Made in America, because I think you're right, that's an opportunity. And our Level the Playing Field Act as well. And then our new bill we're working on Level the Playing Field. This is a really important issue, and I want to back up just for a second and talk about how do we ensure that we can be competitive. There's been a lot of good discussion about the tax laws, but I think there's a new emerging consensus that we need to think about competitiveness in terms of what is called the industrial commons, where you've got manufacturers, you've got suppliers, you've got inventors, and you've got skilled workers kind of all together. And although, as a Republican, I'm always hesitant to talk about the government being too involved in our market, which has ultimately been very successful in making us, a strong and economy a lot of people envy. I think we got to realize that those kinds of industrial commons of all those folks together really does matter. Think of Ohio and Michigan in terms of the auto industry, or think of Boston in terms of the pharmaceutical industry. Here's an interesting statistic. U.S. R&D expenditures in China have grown 13.6% annually on average since 2003. In the United States, it's been just 5%. So what that means is the manufacturing's going on in China. What happens? The R&D starts to go over to China. So this is all connected. And I guess I just asked my three Ohioans about this notion of keeping Ohio manufacturing, innovation, skills, as was just said by Jay, and I agree with Senator Menendez on this, the skilled workers, that's a critical part of this. And we've got some great legislation on that as well. But do you guys agree, my Ohio friends here, that our manufacturing industry and its workers are better off with a healthy industrial commons, with strong supplier networks, lots of R&D investment in skilled workers?
Well, this Ohioan from Chillicothe, Senator, does agree. All roads lead through Ohio, I realize, and thank you for the question. And I'll also say, Senator Wyden, the chairman, mentioned that our goal should be to outcompete China when it comes to research and development. Couldn't agree more, and think that I think this is incredibly important and an incredibly important topic.
Great, thanks. Donnie, Jonathan?
Yeah, Senator Portman, thank you for that, and I appreciate your comments on that. I couldn't agree more with what you said in that venue, and definitely this Ohioan, as well as Jay, says yes to that.
Great. Jonathan, thoughts?
Yeah, and absolutely. And this Ohioan from Steubenville is also fully aligned with the comments, and it's not only for the workers, the consumers, and for America. At the end of the day, we need to make it healthy. And to your point, this is one of the ways for us to get there. Thank you.
Let me ask a specific question. We talked a lot about the importance of the TCJA to investment in jobs, and I couldn't agree more with that. With regard to amortization of R&D expenses, we've had a good discussion about that. I think that's a big mistake. It's going to have a detrimental impact on innovation, of course. And so we've got to be sure that domestic R&D, not amortizing over 5 years, but being able to be fully expensed, stays in the law. And I'm not even going to ask that question because you all seem to agree with that. But there's another one that's similar, and that's for the deduction of interest under 163J. The legislation limited the deduction of business interest based on income before interest and taxes, depreciation, amortization, or EBITDA. But at the end of the year, depreciation and amortization will be removed from further limiting the deduction. You all know about this. It's interesting because right now, a lot of these companies have taken on debt. So it makes it even more difficult to recover from the pandemic, increases taxes basically by limiting the deductibility of interest. Can you comment on that briefly, Ms. Hanlon and Mr. Timmons?
Sure, I'll start. So you're exactly right. This limitation that's in section 163J, now when it's supposed to move to a limitation based on EBIT and not EBITDA, will become more binding, meaning that more companies will be limited in their interest deductions. And, you know, I think the important thing about this is that that limitation can be more binding just by making another investment, not by taking on more debt. So if depreciation is not added back to that calculation, that makes the interest deduction limitation more binding. And again, that can happen with a strictly equity financed investment. So I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, Timmons?
Yes, I think you're correct as well, Senator. Look, we are a highly capital intensive industry, part of the economy. And there are times where we need to borrow so that we can invest in new plants and equipment and ensure that or base that on what our expectations are for future success. Increasing the costs of anything as it relates to doing business here in the United States does harm our ability to compete and succeed in a global economy.
We've got 16 senators to go.
Thank you, Mr. Timmons. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you both. Our next is Senator
Donnie.
Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And to our witnesses, welcome. Great to see all you. I just want to say to Jay Timmons and everybody at NAM, we passed legislation last year, strongly supported by NAM, and I just want to thank you. The greatest challenge we face on our planet is climate change, too much carbon in the air, and one piece of legislation, which NAM strongly supported, the phase down of hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, is worth about 0.5 degrees Celsius, which is a huge advance. It would never happen without the support of NAM. I just want to say thank you. I want to say to our friends at Ford, Ford knows better than anybody that the greatest source of carbon emissions on our planet comes from our mobile sources, about 28%. The power industry in our country is about 27%, and industrial emissions are about 23%. But the biggest one of all is emissions from our mobile sources. I just want to salute Ford for the leadership that you're providing, trying to gather a whole bunch of auto companies together in common cause with California and a bunch of states, including Delaware, to join together in reducing global gas emissions from our mobile sources in the coming years. In that vein, I joined Senator Lamar Alexander last year in amending and extending the 30s. This is a question for Mr. Jennings. I joined Senator Alexander, who sadly left us, but we joined forces in amending and extending the 30C investment tax credit for alternative fuel vehicles through the Securing America's Clean Fuels Infrastructure Act. And that legislation, Mr. Jennings' legislation will better incentivize companies to make investments today in the construction of clean fuel vehicle infrastructure nationwide. It's one thing to build the vehicles, it's another thing to get people to buy them. Unless they have the ability to charge batteries, they're not going to buy them. But Mr. Jennings, can you talk a little bit about the importance of tax incentives and amendments to the tax code, like our America's Clean Fuels Infrastructure Act, for encouraging domestic manufacturing of zero emission vehicles? What more should we be doing to leverage the tax code to reduce emissions from mobile sources and encourage greater innovation in this space? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, thank you for the question, and absolutely fully aligned that climate change is impacting us all. And I appreciate the comments on the efforts that Ford is doing with us, again, being fully aligned with the Paris Accord and also the more stringent green gas standards in California. It is critical for us to continue on and have those tax incentives to give us the opportunity to do the R&D to ensure that we're continuing on the strategy and on the track to be able to be carbon neutral by the year 2050. So those are the, one of the key areas that we would utilize the item that you have referenced along with the other incentives to, again, put us on that path to be able to achieve that by 2050.
All right. My colleagues, I would say I'm struck by the witnesses today. Really excellent panel, but there's a lot of emphasis not in raising taxes, not raising revenues. But we're looking at just an avalanche of debt. I'm a recovering state treasurer from Delaware. We're looking at an avalanche of debt. We spend money in the last administration, this administration. A little bit reminds me a little bit of like drunken sailors. I'm a retired Navy captain. I've seen drunken sailors spend money, and I'm reminded a little bit of that today, and in the last administration as well. Used to be a Senator Russell B. Long, I think he was from Louisiana, might have been the head of the finance committee, but he used to say, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree." And nobody wants to pay more taxes, corporate taxes, personal taxes, but I just would remind us all. About a month ago, the General Accountability Office came out with their high-risk list. They do this every 2 years, high-risk ways of wasting money. One of the things they called for, again, is making sure that we go after the tax gap. The tax gap is money that's owed to the Treasury. We know that it's owed, and we're not collecting it. And the folks at the IRS have asked us to be responsive to the request from the IRS for funding. For the money that we provide, for every dollar, I forget what it is, but it's something like for every dollar we provide in revenues for staffing, for technology at the IRS, they collect something like $5 or $6 in revenues. And while nobody wants to pay any more taxes, the thing that's even more compelling is when we pay our fair share, and we have other folks, other businesses that are not. I would ask us to keep that in mind. Lastly, I probably don't have time to ask this, but I will for the record. I'm going to ask you all for the record to let me know where you think this panel agrees. Where does this panel agree with respect to tax incentives that are needed to strengthen, to enhance domestic manufacturing in this country? Where do you agree? Just give me one idea.
Colleague,
and I'll stop with that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Carper. 15 senators to go, and Senator Langford.
Chairman, thank you. Let me get a chance to be able to jump right into this. Obviously, an issue that's come up over and over again is our supply chain. We talk about manufacturing. That's going to be what is actually coming towards us on our supply chain in the days ahead. So whether it's steel, whether it's producing automobiles, whether it is producing medical equipment, whether it is energy production, supply chain matters on this. That's rare earth minerals, critical minerals, occasionally conflict issues from the Congo and cobalt and lithium and such. So one of the questions I have is, we have multiple of those minerals that are here. When you start dealing with supply chain issues, and I can bring this up to Mr. Jennings at this point, because I know obviously with a vehicle, you've got a lot, especially if we're heading towards an electric vehicle, a lot of issues there. What can we do in the tax code that you see at this point to attract some of those suppliers to be able to come to the United States? Or what are barriers that are actually pushing some of that development outside the United States that makes a vehicle production here or a lot of our manufacturing vulnerable to supply issues?
Actually, really appreciate the question, and you're spot on in reference to not only the overall vehicle assembly, but as you get further into the value chain, those raw materials, how do we ensure that we're able to get those localized? And it goes back to, and I've had multiple discussions with suppliers, making the tax code more incentivized for them to come here, because the true benefit is that true vertical integration, where it's not just the vehicle itself, but all the way through the value chain.
So is there anything particular in the tax code you see right now that is a detriment to actually coming back, or a disincentive to actually bring some of that manufacturing and supply chain here? You'll have to talk louder or turn off one or the other.
I'm sorry, that was my fault. That was my fault. I think I was muted. What we need to do is, again, contain our current competitive tax rate, ensure that we do not step backwards, because we know that there are other nations that are competitive in that space. And in speaking with our suppliers, because of that competitiveness, they're actually looking elsewhere outside of the US. So we need to maintain that competitive tax rate to ensure that we maintain it here in the US.
Okay. Mr. Timmons, let me ask you that same question as well. Things that you see may be a challenge in our tax code to bringing some of those suppliers and to be able to bring those back to the United States to decrease our vulnerability in mineral production and in some of our basic supplies. And then also there's this ongoing conversation about tariffs as well. which is basically a tax issue. If you want to be able to make a comment about that, there's been some folks who say just raise tariffs on everyone else and suddenly miraculously that will come back. We haven't seen that to be completely true. What are the tax barriers there to actually coming back?
Thank you, Senator. You know, I think Mr. Jennings really hit the points on the tax code. Let me offer one other perspective, and that is permitting reform. So some of those critical minerals that you're talking about run into issues when it comes to prompt permitting, and sometimes it could take 3 to 4 years to get the permits in line to do what we need to do to extract those. As far as tariffs go, look, they distort. Obviously, they distort the cost of goods and services. At some point, though, there have been some rationale for certain tariffs that have been applied to attempt to level the playing field against, say, countries like China. What we need to avoid, Senator, is we need to avoid imposing tariffs that would end up causing retaliatory tariffs on our goods leaving the United States. It makes us less competitive. It makes our products less desirable around the world. We want to be able to reach the 95% of customers who live outside of the United States. We need competitive economic policies here at home to grow domestic manufacturing, and we need trade agreements that are enforceable, that enable us to reach other markets.
One of the things I want to be able to bring up, Senator Portman brought up as well as the 163J provision, only because we've got changes that are coming on that soon. What effect does that have for manufacturers and suppliers wanting to be able to come to the United States to see things like that change? And it's a pretty dramatic change at this point. Does that encourage or discourage investment coming back to the United States when they see temporary tax policies?
You're addressing that to me, Senator?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, the change that is coming into effect, if we don't do something about it, if Congress doesn't do something about it, would discourage investment in manufacturing, make it more expensive, obviously, to borrow money. So we're pleased to see the legislation that's being considered before you all.
Okay. We are as well. Hopefully, we'll be able to get that done. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
We can't hear you, Ron.
Senator Cardin.
Thank you. Let me thank our witnesses. This has been an incredible panel, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for conducting this hearing. Manufacturing is critically important to Maryland and our nation. In Maryland, we have over 4,100 companies that participate in manufacturing, over 112,000 jobs. And in the auto industry, we have heavy trucks at Volvo that employ over 1,500 people. So this hearing is very important to me. And I am certainly going to be supportive of changes in our tax code to make domestic manufacturing more competitive, whether it is to deal with innovation and research and development, those provisions, or whether it's industry specific. But I just want to make one observation. We talk about having a competitive tax structure, and it's virtually impossible for us to have that if we don't harmonize with the rest of the world. And what I mean by that is we raise most of our revenues through income taxes, not through consumption taxes, which is what the rest of the world does. And consumption taxes are border adjusted, whereas income taxes are not border adjusted, making U.S. manufacturers at a distinct disadvantage. So, and we talk about having predictability in our tax code. Let's be reasonable about this. The tax code has been changed so many times over the last couple of decades, and don't we expect whatever changes were made in 2017 will be changed again? So I just really want to put on the table that we should be talking about how we can take advantage of the American reliance on governmental services and have not only competitive but low tax rates compared to the global community. And that means harmonizing and having a progressive consumption tax for raising some of our revenues here in the United States. And as the chairman knows, and the ranking member knows, I put that on the table, and I will continue to raise that issue because I think that's the way that we could have the most competitive tax code from the point of view of the issues that we've talked about today. Second point I want to make, and I'm going to go to the floor in a few moments to speak about Mrs. Guzman, who will be the administrator of the Small Business Administration. I hope as we talk about how we can help domestic manufacturing, we recognize there are special needs for the smaller companies, which are where a lot of our job growth takes place and innovation takes place. And we need to make sure that we do focus on the needs of smaller companies, smaller manufacturing companies, as we look at the changes in our tax code. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back my time, and I'm going to go to the floor to speak for Mrs. Guzman and give you 2 extra minutes for other colleagues.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. Senator Young. Senator Young? We don't have Senator Young. Then we have Senator Brown. Senator Casey.
Chairman?
There's Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. I want to thank you for this opportunity. Let me turn my volume up here. And thank the witnesses. I'll just have maybe 2 questions for one witness, and I'll maybe submit some others for the record. But I wanted to start with a question for Donnie Blatt. I appreciate his work with the steelworkers, who obviously have a big presence in my home state of Pennsylvania. And I know they care deeply about the manufacturing jobs that we hope to create, and we've suffered through so much loss. I'm just looking at some of the numbers. By one estimate in Pennsylvania, between January of '05 to January of this year, we've lost over 147,000 manufacturing jobs, and that's on top of the several 100,000 jobs we lost in the 2 or 3 decades before that. So I wanted to ask Mr. Blatt about, first of all, in your testimony, you discussed the power of federal procurement and the ways it can be used to support American manufacturing. I'm also glad to see the administration is focusing on supply chain security and on revisiting rules around Buy American, which are often very complex and riddled with loopholes, including weak rules of origin. I have legislation to establish supplemental rules of origin for non-market economies like China. This will close a back door into our trade agreements and also into government procurement for goods that are not produced under competitive market conditions. So I'd ask Mr. Blatt, can you discuss what a measure like that could mean for workers and particularly steel workers?
Yeah, absolutely, Senator Casey, and thank you for that question. Look, we've dealt with unfair trade agreements, and as our organization has, probably more than anyone else. And our organization believes that these trade agreements should reflect our values, and we should make sure that these non-market economies like China do not have these backdoors that they could get into and steal our jobs out of this country. The Buy America provisions that we have, it creates jobs here in this country, and that's what we're all about. We want to make sure that we create as many jobs as we can, get our manufacturing sector back up to where it should be. And as we do this, it's only going to strengthen our communities and strengthen workers and make sure that our families are taken care of. So, again, trade agreements that reflect our values, and that is taking care of American industry.
I appreciate that. I wanted to talk to you about 2 bills that focus on some of these challenges that we have when it comes to offshoring jobs and the manufacturing impact on workers. One particular proposal I have would establish automatic economic and fiscal stabilizers to communities that are impacted by trade or by industry transition or a huge job loss. I know that there are communities that fit that description in Ohio, plenty of them in Pennsylvania really over my lifetime, especially the last 25 years. This particular bill would provide $100 million in direct economic support to regions to implement both an economic plan and also to implement support for workers and small businesses. So we have one proposal that focuses on regions that have suffered those kinds of of losses by way of transition or job loss. Second bill I have is the Payback Act, which would direct the revenue derived from anti-dumping and countervailing duties back to communities impacted by trade. Just ask you to comment on those proposals, and then we'll wrap up and give time back to the chairman.
I appreciate that, and I remember Mr. Jennings talking about being from Steubenville, Ohio. I'm also from that area, that in southeast Ohio, and if you look in that area, at one time, Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel employed about 3,000 people. The Ormac Corporation that I came out of employed 2,250 people when I hired in 1979. And right beside that, that plant was a consolidated aluminum plant that had 1,700 people that was employed in that as well. So you're just talking about that one area within 50 miles of each other. All those plants are gone and all those jobs are lost. And so that would be a big boost to that region. And it's not like any other regions that you have in Pennsylvania that are all over this country that need that help. And it's what we ought to be doing for our workers and for our communities in this country.
Mr. Blatt, thanks very much. And this is probably the first hearing I've ever been ahead of Senator Brown in questioning. Thank you.
Very good. Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. And I appreciate the fact that both you and Senator Crapo have already raised the issue of protecting critical supply chains, particularly advanced technology like semiconductors. And I know it wasn't too long ago that if we talked about government investment in this category, it might sound like it was industrial policy, and that was a bad name or bad word. But I think we have to understand that we have to use the tax code and in certain places direct government investment to be competitive. I like to point out way back in 1979, the US government put about $4 billion into a new area called GPS that really has revolutionized how our economy works. That $4 billion would be the equivalent of $15 billion today. I think as we think about areas where America needs to lead, the semiconductor industry is a clear example of that. And unfortunately, we've seen Americans' share of the semiconductor industry go from 37% in 1990 down to projected to be about 9% by 2030. In the meantime, China's gone the absolute opposite, from about 12% of the market to 30% expected in 2030. China, matter of fact, and the chairman and I know, sitting on the Intel committee, is looking at $150 billion plus of investment in semiconductors. So there's legislation that was included in the NDAA, the so-called CHIPS Act, that Senator Cornyn, I think, will probably speak to, and a number of members on the committee have been supportive of. But I wanted to ask Mr. Davis, this kind of all of the above, both tax incentives as well as direct government investment in semiconductors, how critical is that for not only Intel, but for maintaining America's position in the global challenges around semiconductors, which we all know is the sauce inside, not to kind of paraphrase your logo, of virtually everything that happens in advanced manufacturing and technology development.
Thank you, Senator Warner, and thank you for your leadership on the CHIPS Act as well. Appreciate that. I think you pointed out the salient statistic, which is there's policy activity that is driving a shift in the U.S. competitiveness for attracting semiconductor manufacturing and semiconductor investment overall. And if you look to China, Taiwan, South Korea, all of the areas where there's been substantial growth in the percent of semiconductor manufacturing taking place, it has been with a coordinated set of policies to induce investment in those countries. So it's a very much in some ways a policy of those countries that semiconductors is so fundamental to their economic base and to their national security that they're going to do things beyond normal tax policy to incent. And really, the U.S. has not taken that position. And so I think you can point to the success of others as a way of perhaps pointing to, if we took a more direct focus on everything from the grants that have been discussed over time and the investment tax credit that's focused on this. This is really a direct response to what is happening in the rest of the world.
Thank you. And I hope, again, I think we will be able to work on this, and I'm glad we got it into the NDAA. I want to turn to my friend Jay Timmons for my last question. And this is a subject, Jay, you and I have worked and talked about a long time. I frankly think if we look back over the last year, the government under both the last administration and this administration stepped up in a major way to deal with COVID. The only challenge, I believe, or the biggest challenge, I believe, we spent about $5 trillion, but not near enough on workforce retraining. I think a number of the jobs that we've lost are not coming back. This is a movement towards a digital economy. You and I have talked, and I'd like you to comment on this. You know, I think we need to create the equivalent of an R&D tax credit for companies that invest in their workforce to increase the quality of that workforce, to alleviate the challenge we have right now where a manufacturing company goes out and spends $5,000 on a robot, you get an R&D tax credit. The robot's an asset. You can put it on your balance sheet. And if you're a public company, you can report it. You make those same investments in workers to be more efficient, in steel workers to be more efficient than the robot, and you don't get any of that tax, accounting, or reporting treatment. Jay, can you speak how we can make sure that we incent companies with the tax code to make that upskilling investment in their workforce?
I know we have just a couple of seconds, Senator. We have been working on this since Communities and Schools days. Thank you for the question. So just a brief synopsis. A tax credit in this area can really play an important role in helping train the workforce of tomorrow. We did make recommendations last year on the supply chain, and we know that high quality earn and learn models are really essential to staff manufacturing facilities efficiently. Defraying the costs associated with these programs, a new deduction could be put in place for items such as you mentioned, some of them, but items like the initial setup costs of wages for learners and trainers, other direct costs associated with these types of programs. And then secondly, I'd say that employees shouldn't be penalized for investments that employers make in their skills. There's guidance right now from the IRS that allows only $5,200 or so for educational assistance to an employee to be excluded from an employee's gross income. And we think that should be at least doubled to about $11,500. And that would increase participation.
I'm very interested in this subject. We just have to move on. Thank you, Senator Warner.
Understood. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing. And I also want to thank our 5 witnesses for lending their time and expertise to the whole committee today. We are looking forward to building a post-COVID economy and strengthening, even supercharging, our manufacturing sector. And it's critical that as we think about this, we identify as many ways as possible to increase investment in research and development in this country. To that end, yesterday, I reintroduced a piece of legislation, the American Innovation and Jobs Act, along with Senator Hassan. This would expand the R&D tax credit for innovative startups and ensure companies can continue to expense R&D costs in the year in which they are incurred. I want to thank Senators Portman and Sass and Cortez Masto for joining Senator Hassan and me in advancing this important bill. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request unanimous consent to insert in the hearing record a letter of support for this bill from Mr. Steve Ferguson, who is CEO of Cook Group, a medical device manufacturer in Bloomington, Indiana, and from Mike Mancetti of Bosch, North America, and they have an electric drive facility in Albion, Indiana.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Jennings, since 1954, companies have been able to deduct their R&D expenditures as they incur them. But beginning in 2022, as I know was mentioned earlier, companies will be required to spread out their deductions over a number of years rather than deduct them all in the current year. If the United States doesn't preserve immediate expensing, it will become one of only 2 countries in the industrialized world, the other being Belgium, that require the amortization of R&D expenses. To continue America's global leadership, we have to ensure the next generation of cars, computers, med devices, and other cutting-edge technologies are developed and produced here in the United States. So, Mr. Jennings, if companies are unable to expense their R&D costs in the year they are incurred, how will that affect Ford's ability to invest in tomorrow's technologies? Mr. Jennings?
Yeah, for some reason I get double muted. Hopefully you can hear me now. So first of all, Senator Young, I appreciate your leadership in this space along with Senator Hassan. It would specifically affect Ford. For example, we spend $5 billion the past 2 years straight. The ability for us to deduct those expenses allows us to prioritize R&D going forward. So it's critical that we continue on with the ability to deduct that, because if we're not in the position for that R&D, it puts us in a non-competitive position globally.
And since you would be in a non-competitive position globally, I presume that also means that your inability to immediately deduct these expenditures would come at the expense of some manufacturing jobs here in the United States and throughout your broader supply chain. Is that indeed the case?
Absolutely. With the total of $5 billion, I mean, that has a substantial impact to our business plan and bottom line. So it's critical for us to be able to continue to deduct those expenses.
Okay. Well, I know Hoosiers certainly care about that. Mr. Davis, in the 21st century, the U.S.'s share of global R&D investments has fallen dramatically from 39% to 29%. Meanwhile, we continue to face stiff competitions from countries like China. China has aggressively focused on growing its R&D sector, and by some estimates will surpass American R&D investment just by the end of this decade. So, Mr. Davis, in your testimony, you rightly point out the danger of an anemic domestic R&D sector, not only for economic loss, but as a genuine national security risk. If we fail to take our competitors seriously, I have grave concerns about the ability of the U.S. to maintain our role as a global leader in this regard. So what signal, Mr. Davis, would an extension of permanent expensing give to companies that are planning their investments over the next few years? Speak to that issue, please.
I think when it comes to tax policy, predictability and competitiveness cannot be overstated. And when you look at R&D, if we don't go back to deductibility, we will be completely out of step from a competitive standpoint with the rest of the world. It's handing our competitors overseas essentially a gift to compete more effectively with the U.S. and to attract more R&D offshore. And I think one of the reasons why there's great bipartisan support for this, and we appreciate your support, Senator, is that just makes no sense.
Well, thank you so much, sir. And as the leader of Intel, we've worked with your team as we've polished this legislation. So I'm aware that passing the American Innovation and Jobs Act would help ensure that Hoosier companies, like our auto assemblers, who have been seeing shortages of semiconductors, would have sufficient and steady access to these important components in the future, thus saving Hoosier jobs and jobs for other Americans. So thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. My time is expired.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you very much, Chairman. If I may, I would like to go back to Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons, last year, the National Association of Manufacturers was identified as the worst obstructor of climate action in America. I doubt that was your favorite day. I'm also prepared to concede that I actually think the Chamber of Commerce earned that distinction more than the National Association of Manufacturers did. You were in a virtual tie with the chamber, but never mind that. My question is, what is the National Association of Manufacturers' position on climate legislation in Congress today?
Senator, thanks for that question. This is not an unexpected question. You and I have had these conversations before, although I have to say I haven't actually seen that study that you cite. So look, as you and I have discussed before, manufacturers are very committed to the cause of climate change and to decarbonizing our environment. In fact, we've shared this with you and others, the Promise Ahead, which is our plan on taking action on climate change. And it's true that we've made some great strides as a nation to reduce emissions that cause climate change, but we've done so oftentimes in spite of policies that come out of Washington and not because of them. We've really spent far too long, I think, apportioning blame over climate change and really too little time working on solutions. And that's why we do call for action, and that's what this plan is all about.
So let's talk about solutions for a moment.
To do that, sir.
First of all, do you see a way forward to solve the climate crisis and avert climate pandemonium without Congress stepping in some significant way?
Well, so look, I think we need a global solution that's binding, and this is something you and I have talked about before as well. And if we could get a comprehensive climate treaty that really is the foundation of the U.S. response to climate change to prevent carbon leakage and solve the underlying problems, I think that's where we need to go. And I look forward to
which Congress would then need to enforce by laws, correct? That's the way those things work.
Sure.
Yeah. So now we've gotten through the predicates and to the punchline here. Assuming that there must be significant climate legislation in Congress, and that NAM would support that as part of your plan, what are the key attributes that legislation should have in order to protect and expand domestic manufacturing?
Well, as I said, it needs to be enforceable globally. We can't do this alone.
So border adjustments?
So we need to be able to enforce actions of our trading partners. I think also, Senator, we have some environmental goods agreements with Europe that we've talked about for a while. We'd like to see that get enacted. And I also think the whole purpose of today's hearing has to do with tax policy and how that can incentivize our ability to do all of the things that we've talked about, not only investing and hiring and raising wages and benefits, but also be able to take on new technologies. The R&D tax credit, for instance, is key to helping us create new technologies that will help us not only clean the air and the water and decarbonize the environment. I mean, those are things that we know where, quite frankly, we know where the world is headed. We know where we want the world to head. Manufacturers are a key to that, and we've been able to make a lot of progress in the last few years. But I believe tax policy and enforceable trade agreements, enforceable trade agreements, but also enforceable climate agreements are critical to our ability to do that.
As we try to figure out how to put enforceable climate agreements and enforceable trade agreements together, one of the things that I often hear is that if you don't have the capacity for the United States to apply border adjustments, and you have other countries that are not in step with our climate strategy, you could have leakage of jobs for the very artificial reason that they've put themselves out of step with our climate strategy. Do you agree with that way of looking at the problem that you described?
So Senator Cardin also mentioned that during this hearing, and we're happy to sit down and talk with you and your colleagues about any proposals that will help us incentivize manufacturing in the United States to meet the goals that we share on cleaning the environment.
But you can see that border leakage is a problem. Potential problem.
Potential.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think my time is just out and I will yield back. And I thank Mr. Timmons for his conversation with me.
I thank my colleague. Senator Hassan, I have to go vote. Why don't you ask your questions? And if Senator Crapo comes back, he will chair until I can get back. All right? So we'll recognize you at this time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I greatly appreciate that. And I certainly appreciate all of the witnesses, and I'm grateful for your testimony. I'm going to follow up on a number of questions you have already heard from Senators Young and others about the importance of research and development tax incentives. So, Mr. Timmons, yesterday I introduced the bill that Senator Young talked about. It's a bipartisan bill with him and Senator Cortez Masto, Portman, and Sass that would strengthen research and development tax incentives for domestic manufacturers and innovative startups. Our bill would expand the R&D tax credit for new and small businesses by doubling the cap on the startup credit. The bill would also strengthen vital R&D incentives for the manufacturing sector by preserving full R&D write-offs. Together, these provisions will help secure U.S. supply chains, boost the economic recovery from COVID-19, and increase our competitiveness with China. Mr. Timmons, in your testimony, you mentioned the importance of our bipartisan bill for domestic manufacturers. Could you elaborate on how strengthening R&D tax incentives would help secure our manufacturing supply chains?
Thank you very much, Senator, and I certainly can. And I thank you so much for your leadership on this very critical piece of legislation and the leadership of Senator Young and the co-sponsors that you mentioned as well. Look, put very simply, research and development is the lifeblood of manufacturing. And manufacturers, as you've already heard today, perform nearly 2/3 of all private sector research and development in the United States, and that's the most of any sector. There is fierce global competition for research and development. And right now, the United States is, frankly, woefully behind the world when it comes to research and development tax incentives. And I worry about amortization. And as you've already heard, if we allow that to occur, the United States and Belgium would be the only countries that require amortization. Look, I think Belgium is a beautiful country, but I don't think that we want ourselves to be in the same economic class or the same economic policies as Belgium. You look at a study by Ernst & Young, and it finds that amortization would reduce R&D spending by about $4 to $10 billion a year. And you've already heard from Mr. Davis that each $1 billion of research and development investment lost could cost about 17,000 jobs right here in the United States. So we need to get back on track. We need to get rid of the amortization clause. Your bill will help ensure that the tax code continues to support innovation, and it's key to helping America be a competitive location for onshoring. And we really do appreciate the fact that this is bipartisan, and we really look forward to working with members on both sides to advance this bill and get it signed into law.
Well, thank you, Mr. Timmons. I appreciate that. I want to give Mr. Davis and Mr. Jennings a chance just to comment on it too. So, Mr. Davis, I would like to ask you about the importance of R&D tax incentives for our country's production of semiconductors, which are obviously critical to our economic and national security. Your testimony discusses how the bipartisan R&D bill would support domestic semiconductor manufacturing. So could you just explain to the committee how these incentives in the bill would promote U.S. leadership on semiconductors?
Sure, thank you. First off, thank you for your leadership and for the bill that you put forth, which I think is so critical to really avoiding regressing on R&D. I mean, the U.S. has been a true leader in R&D, and yes, the rest of the world is investing more over time, but our leadership reflects the 67 years of our treatment for R&D, which understands that encouraging it through deductibility leads to a very positive outcome. And I don't see any reason why we would want to go from what is seen as the world standard today to the most regressive treatment of R&D going forward. And we thank you for your support.
Well, thank you very much for that comment. And Mr. Jennings, could you explain to the committee how strengthening R&D tax incentives, as we do in the bipartisan bill, would help promote domestic production of advanced batteries?
Absolutely. And again, Senator Hassan, appreciate your leadership in this space along with Senator Young. As I had mentioned, $10 billion just in the past 2 years in reference to R&D research within Ford. The ability to have that immediate deduction helps us to prioritize as we continue forward. And we need that to remain competitive globally.
Thank you very much. And I don't see, I do see Senator Crapo, so I'll yield back Senator Crapo, and thank to all the witnesses for your testimony.
Thank you. And next is Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Thank you for this conversation. It's been very enlightening. Let me start with Mr. Jennings, maybe Mr. Davis, because I think going beyond just incentivizing domestic manufacturing to mining and production of raw materials is a conversation worth having. In Nevada, lithium mining is occurring. We have companies that either have to obtain permits or in the process of seeking to mine lithium there. Being able to obtain these critical minerals and resources domestically, we all know will help incentivize domestic manufacturing and technology. And it will be key to meeting the rapidly growing need and balancing our environmental concerns at the same time. It can be done. So, but let me ask you, Mr. Jennings, Mr. Davis, what incentive strategies do you think we can explore to ensure that these credits are available for efficient and safe raw mineral extraction and production as well? We have talked about tax credits for other things, but what about the actual extraction? Have you any thoughts about that?
So, Senator Mastro, I can go ahead and start. We have looked at that because, again, we need to not only look at the original or the vehicle assembly, but all the way through that value chain, because that's how we remain competitive. So not only are we looking at those credits, again, at what we call that tier 1 and OEM level, but all the way through that entire value chain to ensure that we're competitive, again, globally.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yep.
No, I think I agree with Jonathan's points entirely.
Yeah, and I do too. And I think the conversation we were having today is crucial if we are going to really bring back that manufacturing, bring back and make sure our workforce is strong and a part of this new future of innovation economy. And we need to make that investment. I agree with my colleagues that the investment needs to occur here in the United States at so many levels. And that's why I so appreciate this conversation. Let me just say, I also am so happy to be on the bill, the American Innovation and Jobs Act, with my senator colleagues here who have talked about it. But Mr. Timmons, let me ask you this. We have a few small companies leading research and development in Nevada, like Dragonfly Energy. And they assemble battery packs for RVs and are to develop domestic manufacturing of the next generation of lithium-ion batteries in Nevada. And we've talked about some of the options that are available to them through the American Innovation and Jobs Act. But what other options should we be exploring here through the tax code to support small businesses and entrepreneurs to be able to develop new technologies? Do you have any thoughts there?
Thank you for that, Senator. That question, Senator, and also again, thank you for your leadership on the R&D bill. We appreciate that. You have a lot of small and medium-sized manufacturers in Nevada. ClickBond, for instance, is on my board of directors, and they too innovate on new solutions for fasteners for aircraft and other products like that. So I think for small and medium-sized manufacturers, we're going to need to look at, and I realize it's not the focus of today's conversation, but we're going to have to look at making the pass-through rates more competitive. Small and medium-sized manufacturers are at many disadvantages, not the least of which is an outsized burden when it comes to the cost of compliance for regulations, almost twice as much as larger manufacturers. They also find themselves with a less competitive tax code. The pass-through rates are different for them, as you all know, and I welcome having a conversation about that in the future. because that's where the job creation is really the most energizing and robust in this country, small and medium-sized enterprises. And we need to do everything we can to incentivize them through the tax code to be able to do exactly that and to invest more in this country.
Thank you. And I look forward to working. Thank you all for this comment.
Thank you very much. Next is Senator Daines.
All right. Ranking Member Crapo, thank you. Senator Stabenow, Senator Manchin, and I recently introduced a bipartisan bill. It's called the American Jobs in Energy Manufacturing Act. It dedicates $8 billion to a modified version of the Section 48C Advanced Energy Manufacturing Tax Credit that will attract clean energy manufacturing and recycling companies to areas with high unemployment and in places where coal mines or coal power plants have closed. Expanding this credit will provide a powerful tool to help create jobs in coal and other energy producing communities in Montana, as well as across the country, and will ensure these workers continue to play a big part, as they should, in American energy production. However, it's also important we consider how Section 48C would interact with other broader provisions, including several Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions that are set to expire this year if no further action is taken. Professor Hanlon, how would you expect a targeted provision like Section 48C to interact with R&D expensing, the current EBITDA calculation of the limitation on interest deductibility, bonus depreciation, and would a failure to extend these provisions cut against the very positive effects of the Section 48C incentive?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator. I think you're exactly right in the sense that if we don't extend the other provisions like R&D expensing, maybe bonus depreciation, and fix the limitation in 163J, that would cut against these incentives. In other words, you would be giving on one hand and taking away on the other hand, essentially, some of the benefits that we would be providing. And if I can just add, I think the corporate AMT that's being proposed by the Biden administration would also work against these incentives because financial accounting would not have this incentive embedded in it. And so in the AMT side, you wouldn't get that benefit, that incentive. And so it would work against the credit.
Thank you for those comments. Mr. Timmons, in your testimony, you mentioned that businesses across the country have told you the reduction of tax rates on corporate and pass-throughs that were enacted as part of the 2017 tax cuts have sparked new investment by businesses, helped them add jobs, increase wages. One part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that I'm particularly proud of is that 20% deduction for pass-through businesses. In fact, when I look at my home state of Montana, 99% of businesses in Montana are small businesses. As we've seen, remember we were in that debate back in 17, a lot of the job creation in the economy came from the pass-through side, even versus the C-Corp side. I was for lowering rates for both, but we've got to keep our eye on certainly on these pass-throughs. The bill that Senators Cassidy, Scott, Portman, and I recently introduced would make this tax deduction permanent, which I believe would give businesses the certainty to continue investing in businesses as well as the workforce. My question is, in your opinion, wouldn't it be better for Congress to act early to make this deduction permanent before it expires at the end of 2025? And related to that, what would be the consequences of not extending this very important deduction?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator. I think it is a very important question, and it relates to the previous discussion we had about the power of the small and medium manufacturers in this country. In fact, of our 14,000 members, 90% of them are small and medium-sized enterprises. So we see obviously the tax code as very consequential to small and medium-sized enterprises. And yes, I would very much agree with you that we need to take that issue on now, not wait to the last minute. As these businesses are trying to figure out exactly what to do in the future when it comes to expanding their operations or hiring more workers, they need to plan ahead. This can't be something that happens right at the last minute. You specifically asked me, and in fact, I would say I would like to see even more generous tax policy, quite frankly, for small and medium manufacturers, because they truly do power the economy. You asked specifically about some of the results of tax reform from 2017. 263,000 manufacturing jobs were created in 2018. that was the best job growth that we've seen in the sector in over 2 decades. We had the fastest growth in wages of 3% in following tax reform as well. So we've seen a lot of investment. We've seen a lot of job growth because of those tax policies, and we see it in the data. But I also hear it anecdotally. I know you do too. I know Todd O'Hara, the Montana Chamber of Commerce, that's our state affiliate there. I'm sure you and he talk about this a lot. It is anecdotally what you hear from manufacturers all around the country is how they feel empowered and supercharged, even during the pandemic, even during a time when everything should have gone south, and much of it did, clearly. But manufacturing was able to weather the storm because of those competitive policies that we had in place.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Timmons. Senator Crapo, I think I'm out of time. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Sorry, Steve. Next is Senator Cornyn.
Well, thank you, Senator Crapo, and I'm grateful to you and Chairman Wyden for having this hearing. Really, what I would like to do is just first make a confession. I'm one of those who, from an economic standpoint, always thought that efficiency and low-cost providers was a good idea, no matter where the manufacturing occurred. But I have reevaluated my opinion in light of the pandemic and in light of the vulnerability of our supply chains in general. And many of us have mentioned in the course of this hearing and elsewhere about the importance of our competition with China, whether it's in 5G, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, or you name it. And so I do think some sort of industrial policy considerations need to apply. And the question I have for each of the witnesses is, if you had to choose between an annual appropriations process and a refundable tax credit like the CHIPS for America Act that Senator Warner and I have proposed and that many others on a bipartisan basis have supported, which would you choose if you had to choose just one in terms of its predictability and usefulness? Anybody who would like to answer, maybe start with Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn, and thank you for your leadership on the CHIPS Act. And I think an annual appropriation is difficult for those of us who make large investments and have to make decisions about what is the environment that we're going to be making those investments. So moving away from annual and going back to, as I said, predictable and competitive. And in our case, that's competing with Asia for attracting semiconductor investment. So much more on the intent of the CHIPS Act.
Mr. Timmons, do you have a view on that?
Certainly, and I agree completely. An annual appropriation, unfortunately, or an annual decision, if you will, does not make for predictability or stability. And we do need that in order to compete and succeed in a global economy. And I will say this, Senator, I think you can have both products made in America. Look, I represent manufacturers in America. I want everything made in the United States, and I want American workers to benefit. We know that that's not possible every time, but we ought to be doing everything we can to attract investment and job creation here. And so I would say you can do that, and you can have low-cost products being made here as long as we have the right tax and regulatory policies in place, which is what this hearing is all about today. And I completely agree with your statement, support that legislation, and hope that we can see it enacted.
Thank you. If it's one thing that the virus has taught us, it's about the vulnerability of our supply chains, and starting with PPE, but it doesn't end with PPE. And obviously semiconductors, China's building 17 foundries as we are thinking about building one or having one built in Arizona. So I think this is a critical one, but it's not the only critical one. So I hope that all of you will help contribute to our thinking about how we prioritize the manufacturing that does have national security implications in addition to just the economics of the situation. So thank you for being here. Thanks for your testimony. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. I'm not sure if we have any senators who remain back yet. There's a vote going on and we expect some to come back, but let me go through. Is Senator Cassidy available? And how about Senator Brown? All right, well, I have a couple of questions that I didn't get to. And so while we wait for a couple of those senators to come back, or the chairman to come back, let me go on with the line of questioning that I started out with. I think many of you very capably pointed out the importance of protecting our tax credits for investment in research and development, and having a stable system in which we don't go through this annual process for the tax extenders, or even the longer process that we got out of the reconciliation bill for some of the tax credit policies. And I agree very much with that. I'm very concerned, however, about some of the reports that we are getting from the White House in terms of its intended proposals for tax policy that would increase the broad base, what I consider to be the very important base of the corporate income tax rate reductions that we achieved in the TCJA. We reduced it, as you recall, from 35% to 21%, which still left us, when you look at the averages that Michelle Hanlon pointed out, still left us with one of the higher tax rates, but still competitive, right, really sort of in the middle of the pack, if you will, with our global competitors. And so I just would like to ask, I see the chairman back, so let me just ask Mr. Davis and Mr. Blatt, if you could each just quickly respond to that concern that I have, that we should not look at offsetting the needed stability we need in the R&D and investment tax credit arena with a corporate tax rate increase.
Yeah, I think they work against each other. It's I think, as Michelle talked about earlier, it's giving with one hand and taking with another. And really, as you know, the R&D tax credit is not a give; it's a void, moving to a takeaway that would make us completely uncompetitive with the rest of the world. And so, fully support a focus on predictable, very competitive global corporate tax rate, and then preserving the deductibility for R&D.
Thank you. And Mr. Blatt? I think he may have stepped away from the camera for a minute. With that, oh, here he is. Here he is. Did you hear the question, Mr. Blatt?
I did hear the question, Senator Crapo, and I appreciate the question. I probably have more of a unique opinion on R&D than probably the others do, and I think there's probably two types of R&D that we look at as an organization. First of all, the first part of the R&D is the fact that we're trying to make sure that we stay competitive and we have more productivity. In that respect, I would be okay with making sure that we keep the tax rate low for that type of R&D. But if we're doing research and development to try to lower the workforce or take people out of the workplace, then I would have a different view of that. So that would take people out of the economy, and I think that goes against what we're trying to do here.
Thank you, and I did want your perspective on that. Mr. Chairman, I see that. Mr. Chairman, I'm ready to turn it back to you, and I think Senator Brown is the next one in line.
Thank you, Senator Crapo, and Senator Brown is indeed the next one in line. I want to thank all my colleagues for their patience. We've had a lot of senators interested, and understandably so. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Crapo, just like old times calling on me. Thank you. I appreciate that. Last week, 81 workers in Bucyrus, Ohio, saw their jobs outsourced to China. Bucyrus City Council, the union, offered to find ways to save the jobs. I sent a letter to the company offering to work with the stakeholders to find a solution. GE Savant refused. Now 81 workers face tough conversations at a kitchen table about how their families survive. What do we do next? In this case, GE's lighting plant in Logan, Ohio makes the glass for remaining assembly lines in Bucyrus. Its workers belong to the USW. So, Mr. Blatt, briefly, what happens to U.S. workers in factories when parts of a supply chain like that move overseas?
Thank you, Senator Brown. Unfortunately, we see a lot of that within our country and within our union, companies moving overseas. And in this particular instance with Savant, we just actually got done getting a contract with the company in Logan, Ohio. But now the fact that they make the glass casings for the LED lights that are finished in Bucyrus, now that plant is now looking for a place. What are they going to do with these glass casings that they're making? That puts pressure not only on the company to find someplace to put their product, but it also puts pressure on the workers to know whether they're going to have a job or not. But then puts pressure on the communities to wonder if those jobs are going to be available for workers now or workers in the future. So unfortunately, it puts all kinds of pressure on all kinds of people. And you know, companies like GE are famous for doing that stuff, and it seems that will put pressure now to maybe leave that facility in Logan, Ohio as well.
Well, thank you, and we will continue to talk to you and to the two communities about it. Mr. Timmons, it was good talking to you the other day. I always appreciate the chance to talk to a fellow Ohioan. Thank you for that. What steps can we as policymakers take to halt the closure of plants in towns like Bucyrus?
Senator, you missed the Ohio Love Fest here that we had just a little while ago. You have three panelists with Ohio ties, so it's always good to be with Ohioans. Senator, that's a great question, and it is one that we addressed in our proposal on strengthening manufacturing supply chains. I think it really applies to existing facilities that are here as well, and that is making sure that we have a tax credit that encourages a broad-based tax credit that encourages manufacturing investment here. Support for workforce training programs. Donnie, I was very happy to hear him talk about the need for ensuring that we are not only training, but retraining and future-proofing jobs. A tax credit would help manufacturers achieve that. We've already talked about ensuring that the tax code supports research and development, protecting interest deductibility, and getting an annual report on American competitiveness. This is something we're not doing. There's been some discussion today of industrial policy, and I know that for years we've kind of avoided that term. I frankly am not afraid of that term. It doesn't bother me because everything we do should be directed at strengthening manufacturing and increasing manufacturing jobs here in the United States. But I think all of those things, Senator, as well as infrastructure investment, as I mentioned in my opening statement, and other priorities can help us do exactly that here in this country to make sure that we're more competitive.
Thank you. There was bad news, another case today that we just heard. And Mr. Jennings, as a Clevelander, I want to talk to you about this. Clevelanders turned on the local news and saw headlines about yet another American corporation deciding to build things in Mexico instead of Ohio. Ford had made a 2019 commitment to invest $900 million in the Ohio Assembly Plant in Lorain and in Avon Lake, Ohio, an investment they promised would create more than 1,500 jobs. Ford announced instead it's decided to not honor that promise and instead build next generation vehicle in Mexico. Mr. Jennings, you know how important Avon Lake facility is to Lorain and Northeast Ohio. What the decision to turn its back on the community is just unacceptable. Give me your thoughts about that. What an investment like that would mean to a community.
So thank you for the question. And as you know, Ford employs more hourly workers in the U.S. than any other automaker, and we choose to invest in America more than any other automaker. Specific to the Ohio Assembly Plant that you referenced, we've actually invested $185 million and created 100 new jobs there at the assembly plant. We are invested at that facility. And we're looking to actually increase the capacity that that facility provides from a Super Duty truck perspective for such a strong demand. So we're going to continue to invest and support that particular facility there in Ohio.
But the $900 million commitment is no longer, is that what you're saying?
We're continuing to work and invest in that facility. 185 million has been invested at that site as we continue to look at other activities for other vehicle programs that we will be looking outside of Ohio.
150 is significantly less than 900 million. That even people in Washington can do that math. So I'm hopeful that your company will step up and do the right thing here. This is not the last time you'll hear from us. We've talked to the administration. President Biden has strong feelings, I know, about this, and I'm hopeful we can find a way to invest in this community. I know that kind of investment in an auto plant. I've seen it in Lorain. I've seen it in Toledo. I've seen it in Youngstown. That kind of investment creates huge numbers of good-paying union jobs and good-paying management jobs too, and we want to continue it. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Senator Cassidy is next. And then Senator Sass will close for the day. Senator Crapo, perhaps you know about the whereabouts of Senators Cassidy and Sass. You're on mute.
Oh. My understanding is that Senator Sass won't be able to make it back, and since Senator Cassidy is not here now, I'm assuming the same is true for him. Mr. Chairman, I would assume we could wrap up.
I'm going to wrap up just with a quick statement, because I want you all to know what I'm taking away from this, because I think it has been a very productive session. A lot of constructive thoughts being offered by senators of a variety of different philosophies. And to me, the takeaway is that it is urgent business for elected officials to create the conditions for a homegrown semiconductor industry that employs high-skill, high-wage workers for a decade, not just for a year. And that's my takeaway. And I will just tell you, as the chair of this committee, I have seen too many short-term tax policy mistakes. One year I voted against a tax extender package because I said I'm not going to support any tax extenders with a shelf life shorter than a carton of eggs. So we have had one short-term policy after another, one fiscal cliff after another. And I just want you walking out of here to know I intend to work with Senator Crapo and all of our colleagues to come up with a strong policy, and I think it can be bipartisan, that creates the conditions for the kind of homegrown industry that ensures that we can outcompete China. That's what this is all about, outcompeting China. So I want to thank all of our guests today, all of our witnesses and the members. We had very high turnout among members, which shows how strongly colleagues feel about this. And I guess the hearing's wrapping up, but it is in the to be continued department, because issues like the research and development question, it cannot afford to wait. Every single day is a mistake to allow that to continue. So, to be continued. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.